that the events team are recording Paul's presentation, but the questions and answers at the end of the presentation will not be recorded. Okay, thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Yeah, I just wanted to get the recording so I can give that to the Centre for Environmental Law at Macquarie Uni, where I'm located. We're trying to, at the moment, generate, quite a bit of publicity for our work. So thank you, Werner and the team for allowing that. I'm just going to share my screen. I have got some slides here. Okay, everyone can see that? Yeah? Okay. Okay, so yeah, thanks, Emily. Thanks again to Werner, and thank you to the team at the University of Southampton. I'd also like to thank Werner's team at the University of the Western Cape. They were the ones that initially fielded my questions about participating in the conference and what have you. So thank you to them as well, and especially if they're listening. So I'm going to talk today about the theme of pandemic speed and how this can be applied, I think, to the question of extinction at the global level. Now, to be honest, that's kind of where the association with COVID kind of ends.
Oh, sorry, your slides aren't going along. There only seems to be showing one of two slides.
Okay.
Not the whole slide deck.
Okay, so sorry, can you see the title slide?
We can see the title slide, but it looks like there's only two slides on that deck.
Oh, okay. And you can see this one? Yeah,
we see the initial title slide, and that's it.
Oh, that's it. Okay. Oh, it's a bit of a problem. I'm not quite sure why that's the case.
I have got it on file if you want me to share on your behalf.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Thanks. Okay. Yeah, we can do that. Yeah.
You could stop sharing, then I'll.
Okay, all good. Thank you.
No.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll just keep going. So, yeah. So what I'm concentrating here on is this idea of pandemic speed, and I take this idea of pandemic speed and apply it to how law can respond to, in particular, the rate of biodiversity and biodiversity loss and extinction at the global level. So what I'm trying to sort of get to with this particular research is how we can use climate law in particular to try and invigorate and push a response, a faster, more rapid response to extinction and biodiversity loss. Now, can we go to the next slide, please? So the key thing from that I'm looking at in this research is the role of climate change in particular on biodiversity loss and extinction. So what we've witnessed recently in Australia, now all of you I suspect would know about this, so I don't need to go into too much detail, is the catastrophic levels of biodiversity loss and potential extinction, or in some cases extinction, we don't know yet. That was the result of the bushfires around just over 12 months ago. Now, any natural disaster of this magnitude will have an impact on biodiversity, quite obvious. But what was significant, I think, in the Australian context and perhaps in a global context, is that so many of the species that have been that were impacted by and continue to be impacted by the bushfire were already critically endangered. Now, the process by which these species became critically endangered is, I mean, there are multiple drivers, especially in the Australian context. There's things like land clearing is a particular problem, related habitat loss, etc. But what was interesting was how these slower incremental drivers were then suddenly and abruptly exacerbated by the bushfire, and the categorization of species from critically endangered to on the brink of extinction happened with an alarming pace, an alarming rapidity. And it's this change in speed, the change in speed that shifts a species status from critically endangered to on the verge of extinction, if not extinction. That's the kind of thing that I am targeting here with this analogy of pandemic speed. Emily, can you go to the next one, please? Thank you. So in terms of speed, I look at climate change as I say there, the great accelerator. And climate change, going just to the top point there about the extinction vortex, climate change is a force which can as I said, very rapidly change the pace of biodiversity loss, taking a species from critically endangered to extinction very, very quickly. And the question is, well, can law respond? And again, as I said, the bushfires are a particular incident in recent Australian history, but the most, I think, compelling chapter in this emerging story of multiple speeds of extinction was perhaps, if you drop down to the second last bullet point there, the Bramble Cay melomai, which was a small marsupial rodent that has the sort of terrible distinction of being the first mammal to be driven to extinction as a result of climate change. Now, this gives an excellent example of the two speeds that I'm talking about. The melomai was categorized as critically endangered as a result of the loss of its habitat, which is fairly typical. The loss of its habitat was very closely associated with drivers such as the introduction of invasive species, but also sea level rise. So the numbers were incrementally and gradually dropping. The number of the species, the range of the species, all those indicators of biodiversity loss and extinction were occurring on this incremental sort of basis or incremental speed. However, in the aftermath of the extinction of the melomai, what was found was, whilst its range of distribution and numbers were dropping due to sea level rise, the event that took it from that status to extinction were extreme events, were storms, basically. So again, it's an excellent example of what I'm trying to sort of unpack here in terms of law's response. The multiple speeds at which particular environmental events can very quickly be turned into an extinction event due to the acceleration caused by climate change. Emily, could you go to the next one, please? So what I'm trying to formulate here in terms of legal response is so I'm just going to quickly shift this up to there. Yeah, a conception of adaptation with the prevention of preventable extinction at its core. And this starts with linking climate change and extinction in international environmental law. Now, as you can probably see from the top of my slide there, I've first established this within the regime of Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, you take the convention itself through the Aichi targets and all the way through to the post-20 goals that were released only last year. And we get a very sort of mixed message in terms of how climate change, extinction, and general sort of biodiversity loss are all sort of linked. It's a particularly weak linkage because whilst the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Aichi targets, and even now the post-20 goals, whilst there are references to extinction and there are references to climate change, the two are never really linked in a particularly strong way. So the reason, I think, being is that the Convention on Biological Diversity lacks a mechanism whereby it recognizes loss. And I think this is a particularly important thing that separates perhaps the sort of the incremental nature of biodiversity loss and extinction. This idea of a mechanism which recognizes how quickly a situation can deteriorate. Emily, can you move to the next one, please? So what sort of prompted me then in relation to looking at speed was the climate law regime. Because the climate law regime has a mechanism built in to take care, well, not to take care of, but has a recognition of loss. And that, of course, is represented by the principle of loss and damage, which is, as I said there, a relatively new sort of area of climate change law. So now we come to the problem or the issue of, well, how in climate law then is biodiversity loss and extinction recognized in terms of loss and damage? Well, it isn't really, or it isn't particularly strongly. The presence of the biodiversity loss in the climate law regime is negligible. The Paris Agreement only mentions biodiversity once, and that's in the preamble. I can't remember exactly which paragraph of the preamble it sits in, but it's the same one that mentions Mother Earth. So it's, you know, it's a very sort of aspirational type of reference. There are actually zero mentions of extinction in any of the legal instruments of the climate law regime. And by legal instruments, I mean the UNFCCC, the Convention on Climate Change, Kyoto Protocol through to the Paris Agreement. There is a tension, though, that is concentrated on the relationship between temperature rise and the possibility of biodiversity loss. However, there is nothing that links extinction and adaptation. And to me, I think this is absolutely essential. If we're going to seriously look at biodiversity loss and extinction and the relationship to climate change, it's absolutely essential that we take a view of adaptation which puts the status, puts the fate of non-human species at the center of all climate change adaptation formulations and interventions. Now, there is somewhat something of a link between biodiversity loss and adaptation that's given in the UNFCCC. And this is a little bit of an aside, but I think it sort of sets the tone for how climate law could respond and could provide a more rapid, faster response to the prospect of extinction. So what Article 2, and that's the Article 2 contains the objective of the UNFCCC of the Climate Change Convention. It says, well, part of it says, such a level should be achieved within a time, so what it means by level is a level of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, so it's referring to mitigation. It says that this level of mitigation should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change. Now, this is quite an interesting sort of take. I mean, we have to remember the convention was came into effect in the early 90s, and so some of this research and scientific knowledge and information looks a little bit dated by now. But what's interesting about it, though, is it does sort of make this connection. It does understand that there is stress on ecosystems. And it does sort of understand that there is a capacity for ecosystems to adapt naturally, to adapt to change. The problem, though, is pace. The problem is speed. Because you see there, should be achieved within a time frame sufficient. And that is well and truly gone. The idea that whole idea within the objective was contingent on humanity maintaining a sufficient time frame, responding with requisite speed. Now, what this sort of opens up as well is not just the relationship between climate change adaptation and biodiversity loss or ecosystem loss and extinction. It also prompts the question, have we effectively failed one of the objectives of the UNFCCC? Which is quite an interesting question, because the objective of the UNFCCC is kind of vague. It lacks, a temperature goal, as is present in the Paris Agreement, and of course it lacks an emissions cap. But this is one of the only areas where we could potentially say, the nations have actually failed one of the objectives of the UNFCCC. Emily, next slide, please. So that moved me to the current question, and that is, can climate law recognize and capture the speed of climate-induced extinction? So, sorry, it's a bit repetitive there. I said, Article 2 of the UNFCCC sets that tone. But then we move forward to the Paris Agreement. And in the Paris Agreement, we have under Article 7, adaptation, and under Article 8, we have loss and damage. And so the question then becomes, if we have failed in terms of Article 2 of the Convention to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally, to allow that sufficient time frame, are we now into the territory of loss and damage? Despite the sort of potential positives by sort of associating extinction as loss and damage, and then asking ourselves, right, this should incentivize us to respond more quickly to the prospect of climate-induced extinction, we still come up with a problem. And that's not necessarily just a problem of the application of law to biodiversity science, or what we could call the extinction science. It's within the law itself. It's within the terms of some of the legal sort of agreements, I suppose, that compose the climate change regime outside of the Paris Agreement. So when we talk about loss and damage, we do see through a number of different documents biodiversity loss. It does appear. However, from the Cancun adaptation framework, which first included or first put on the official agenda the concept of loss and damage. So from the adaptation framework all the way through to the latest reports of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage that were released late last year in 2020, biodiversity loss is invariably framed as slow onset loss. So just to give you a bit of background there, loss and damage tends to work or tends to be categorized in two ways. Rapid onset loss or sudden onset loss, which in the Paris Agreement is only referred to as extreme weather, or slow onset loss. Now, biodiversity loss is only categorized as slow onset loss under international climate law. This is a huge problem because, as I said earlier, with regards to the bushfires in Australia last year, the tragic episode of the Malamai, the extinction of the Malamai, and also in conjunction with some of the latest reports on the relationship between climate change and biodiversity loss. What we're finding, and if you quickly look at the quotes here from this article here by Arneth and other authors, the impacts of the frequency and severity of weather extremes have been much less studied than the impacts of mean climate change, but could be important determinants of the resilience of communities. Basically, what Arneth and others are saying is that what has been, I wouldn't say underestimated, but probably not as well understood up until this point, are questions of abrupt loss, questions of extreme conditions that have pushed species, as I said earlier, from the critically endangered status to extinction status. Thanks, Emily. So where do we sort of go from here? Well, a couple of things, I've got a couple of suggestions, but first of all, I just want to say what this revealed to me and others is the paucity of references to biodiversity loss and the complete lack of references to extinction in the climate law regime underlines how anthropocentric the value system within the climate law regime is. It goes a little bit back to, I think, a question Werner asked following Otto's paper. So what we need to be really looking at here is the interpretation of biodiversity loss and preventable extinction through climate change adaptation. Can we recognize extinction as loss? And then can we in turn take that interpretation of loss and feed it back into our formulation, interpretation, implementation of climate change adaptation? There will be many more cases like the Malamai that we witnessed in Australia. There'll be many more cases, not just in Australia, but elsewhere, of where incremental changes, incremental environmental changes will continue to threaten species in terms of all these biodiversity loss and extinction drivers. But the thing that actually will push the species over the edge could happen much more rapidly. Emily, could you go to, I think, the final slide, please? So we have to sort of look at this, I think, the application, or as I say, the misapplication of loss and damage as a positive lesson. What we find is that the current framing of biodiversity loss within the Paris Agreement, within loss and damage, and the climate law regime overall, does not align with the concept of the extinction vortex. It does not understand that the drivers of biodiversity loss and therefore extinction can work at staggeringly different speeds and different paces. So what we then need, if I'll just drop down, I know I'm very short of time here. The legal dynamics, the legal category, sorry, must be dynamic and responsive. If we have any chance of creating and formulating a regulatory solution to this problem, if climate change law can contribute in any way to arresting the rate of extinction, it must act in a more responsive, dynamic, and nuanced way in terms of understanding the speed of biodiversity loss. So my suggested way forward, in terms of loss and damage, frame biodiversity loss in the context of extinction. This thereby reflecting a better understanding of how the process operates at different speeds due to the acceleration of climate change, the accelerating factor of climate change, and then interpret and apply these commitments to a different formulation of adaptation, which puts biodiversity loss and extinction at the center. I'll just conclude with a couple of remarks here. This is desperately important at this time, not just to arrest biodiversity loss and extinction and act with that sort of pandemic speed, that pandemic speed that I was talking about at the beginning, but at such an important time at the juncture of the climate change regime. We need to ensure that this centralized approach to extinction biodiversity loss, centralizing this within adaptation, needs to happen now because we're on the verge of the global stocktake and the adaptation goal under the Paris Agreement. And these things will be borne out in the current or in the second round of the nationally determined contributions to NDCs. And so the timing is absolutely crucial. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Many thanks for that, Paul. And also thank you very much for being very responsive to my